The biggest mistake a bully can make is believing the quiet man has already lost. The smell of fresh asphalt reached me long before I saw the machines. It rolled across the morning air with that sharp mix of hot tar, diesel exhaust, and dust that every highway contractor knows by heart. I slowed my pickup at the top of the hill, and for a second I honestly wondered if I had taken the wrong road. Then I saw it. A brand new entrance boulevard stretched across the southern edge of my property, perfectly graded, freshly paved, lined with decorative stone columns that hadn't existed a week earlier. Workers in reflective vests moved between bulldozers and rollers while a landscaping crew planted rows of young oak trees beside a polished monument sign that read, "Welcome to Cedar Ridge Estates." The sign stood squarely on my land. Not beside it, not near it, directly on my land. I pulled onto the gravel shoulder and shut off the engine. The sudden silence inside the cab made the distant rumble of heavy equipment sound even louder. My fingers rested on the steering wheel while the heat from the Texas sun baked through the windshield. 2,300 acres. 3 generations. Every fence line, every creek, every hill, every survey marker was as familiar to me as my own fingerprints. My grandfather bought this ranch in 1964 with money he earned hauling cattle across half the state. My father expanded it one pasture at a time. When they passed it on to me, they didn't just leave behind land. They left behind responsibility. That's something people who treat property like numbers on a spreadsheet never understand. A ranch remembers every pair of boots that ever crossed it. The crunch of gravel interrupted my thoughts as a white luxury SUV rolled toward me. Linda Harper stepped out wearing a spotless cream-colored blazer that somehow looked untouched by the construction dust swirling around her. She smiled the way real estate agents smile before handing someone paperwork they haven't fully read. "Mr. Walker," she called cheerfully. I was hoping we'd finally meet. I looked past her shoulder at the steady stream of cement trucks entering through what used to be my southern pasture gate. "You paved my ranch." She laughed softly, almost like I'd made a harmless joke. "Oh, don't think of it that way. We're creating a beautiful community entrance everyone can enjoy. It'll raise property values for the entire area." Her words floated through the warm air, while another dump truck rolled across ground my family had owned for more than 60 years. I noticed something most people would have missed. The county survey stakes were gone. Every single one. In their place stood temporary orange construction flags that meant absolutely nothing in court. Linda folded her arms confidently. "The developers handled all the permits. Everything's completely legitimate." I nodded once. No argument. No raised voice. No threats. Just one quiet nod. That seemed to confuse her more than anger ever could. She expected a fight. She expected lawyers by lunchtime. She expected me to panic because hundreds of people were about to drive across my ranch every single day. Instead, I climbed back into my truck, started the engine, and drove away without another word. In my rearview mirror, I watched Linda grin, convinced silence meant surrender. What she didn't know was that every fresh layer of asphalt, every brochure they printed, every home they sold using that entrance road wasn't solving their problem. They were building it bigger with every passing hour. By the time I reached the old ranch house, the smell of asphalt had faded, replaced by cedar, dry grass, and the familiar scent of fresh coffee drifting from my kitchen. That contrast always reminded me why my family had fought so hard to keep this place. Out there, people saw empty acreage waiting for development. I saw memories measured in fence posts instead of dollars. My grandfather, Samuel Walker, bought the first 600 acres after returning home from years of hauling livestock across Texas. Every profitable season, he bought another parcel. My father continued the tradition, negotiating with neighboring ranchers one handshake at a time until the property reached 2,300 acres. They believed land should never be rushed, and neither should decisions made about it. My father used to tell me that every survey pin had a story attached to it. If one ever disappeared, somebody usually wanted you to forget where the truth was buried. I understood exactly what he meant as I walked into the study that evening. The room had barely changed in 30 years. Walnut shelves covered one wall. A faded county map hung above an old steel filing cabinet with scratches from decades of use. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots exactly the way it had when I was 10 years old following my father through stacks of property records that seemed as tall as I was. While other kids spent weekends playing video games, I learned how to read deeds, easements, mineral rights, and survey plats. Back then it felt painfully boring. Years later, after building highways and county infrastructure across 3 different states as a civil engineer, I realized those weekends had quietly become the most valuable education of my life. I opened the cabinet and slid out a thick leather binder labeled Southern Boundary. Every page smelled faintly of aged paper and machine oil from the workshop, where my father insisted every important document should stay protected from humidity. Inside were surveys stretching back decades, each signed, stamped, and carefully indexed. Nothing about my Southern Boundary had ever changed. Not once. The entrance road Linda proudly showed me that morning simply did not exist on a single legal record inside that binder. I poured another cup of coffee and carried it onto the porch just as the sun dipped below the western pasture. From there I could barely make out the construction lights glowing in the distance like a small city growing where cattle had grazed only weeks before. I listened to coyotes calling somewhere beyond the creek while traffic from the construction site echoed faintly across the valley. They worked late. They were in a hurry. That usually meant deadlines, investors, and promises that had already been made to buyers. I had seen that kind of pressure before on commercial projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Developers hate delays because delays become expensive. Expensive decisions often lead people to cut corners. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors asking if I planned to sue immediately. One attorney even left a voicemail offering emergency representation. I thanked him politely and declined. Lawsuits filed too early often protect the people creating the problem because they stop them before their mistakes become impossible to explain. I wanted every promise they made, every advertisement they printed, every closing document they signed, and every homeowner they welcomed through that entrance to become part of the same story. They believed they were building the front door to a luxury community. I already knew they were quietly constructing the strongest evidence I would ever need. The following week, Cedar Ridge Estates transformed from a noisy construction site into the hottest real estate conversation in the county. Every morning, I drove the perimeter fence before sunrise, listening to meadowlarks while the distant hum of generators slowly grew louder as another workday began. By 8 o'clock, the air filled with the smell of fresh mulch, cut lumber, and concrete dust. Pickup trucks lined the brand-new entrance road, and polished sales banners fluttered beside rows of newly planted trees that had not been there a month earlier. Linda Harper was everywhere. She rode through the subdivision in a white golf cart, greeting prospective buyers with the confidence of someone who believed the future already belonged to her. She spoke about community values, exclusive amenities, and convenient access as if she personally owned every inch beneath her tires. What caught my attention was not what she said. It was what she printed. Every glossy brochure displayed an aerial map with that entrance road highlighted in bright green. The caption proudly called it Cedar Ridge Parkway, the signature gateway connecting residents directly to the county highway. I picked up one of the brochures from the Welcome Center without anyone recognizing me. The heavy paper still smelled like fresh ink. Across the bottom sat the words, Private Community Entrance, exclusively maintained by Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. I quietly folded the brochure and placed it inside my truck beside the old leather binder from my father's study. Another piece of the puzzle had just found its place. Over the next several days, I noticed survey crews returning, but none of them ever crossed onto my side of the original property line. They measured inside the subdivision, adjusted landscaping, and marked utility locations, yet the actual boundary separating my ranch from the development remained untouched. That told me something important. Someone knew exactly where my land ended. They simply hoped nobody else would notice. The sales office became busier every afternoon. Families walked through model homes carrying coffee cups and floor plans. Children laughed while exploring sidewalks that curved toward the entrance road crossing my ranch. Delivery trucks arrived with furniture, mailboxes, and decorative lighting. Contractors installed security cameras, stone monuments, and neighborhood signs directly beside pavement that legally rested on my property. Every improvement increased the value of homes being sold. Every closing strengthened the promises made to buyers. Every advertisement repeated the same claim that the entrance belonged to the community. Linda even gave a short interview to a local newspaper, smiling beneath the polished monument sign while explaining how careful planning had created seamless access for future residents. I clipped that article the same evening and slipped it into the binder beside the brochure. By Friday, several neighbors stopped by my ranch expecting frustration or anger. Instead, they found me repairing an old section of fence near the north pasture. One rancher leaned against his truck and shook his head. He asked why I looked so calm when someone was obviously taking advantage of me. I tightened another fence wire before answering. People rarely destroy themselves with one bad decision. They do it by repeating the same mistake until it becomes impossible to deny. As the sun settled behind the hills, headlights streamed through the newly paved entrance while sales agents celebrated another successful week. They believed every new homeowner proved they had won. From where I stood, every car driving across that road carried another witness, another document, another promise that would eventually have to face the same unmovable property line my grandfather had marked decades before. 2 weeks passed, and the subdivision stopped looking like a construction project and started looking like a finished promise. Every morning the sound of garage doors echoed through the valley as the first homeowners backed their shiny sport utility vehicles onto a road that should never have existed. Freshly planted flower beds lined the entrance. Decorative streetlights glowed before sunrise. Even the smell had changed. The sharp bite of hot asphalt had given way to fresh sod, mulch, and the sweet scent of newly watered landscaping. Someone had invested a fortune making that entrance look permanent. That was exactly what I hoped they would do. One afternoon, I parked across the county highway and watched the sales office from inside my truck. A young couple walked out carrying a folder and smiling the way people do when they believe they have just found the perfect place to build a future. Moments later, another family followed with a real estate agent pointing proudly toward the entrance road. I could not hear every word through the closed windows, but I heard enough. She called it private access maintained by the association. She described it as one of the community's strongest selling points. She never hesitated. She never looked uncertain. She believed every sentence she spoke. That confidence fascinated me because confidence built on the wrong foundation usually collapses all at once. A few days later, my mailbox filled with glossy advertisements. Cedar Ridge Estates had launched a countywide marketing campaign. The same entrance road appeared on postcards, newspaper inserts, online advertisements, and large roadside banners. Every photograph highlighted the stone monument, the landscaped median, and the smooth pavement crossing my ranch. The brochures even featured drone photographs taken from directly above my southern pasture. Someone had paid a professional photographer to capture images of property they did not own. I carefully placed every advertisement inside protective sleeves. Ink fades. Over time. Evidence should not. My neighbor, Bill Henderson, stopped by one evening carrying 2 cold bottles of root beer. We sat on the porch watching headlights drift through the valley as another stream of visitors entered the subdivision. Bill finally asked the question everyone seemed afraid to ask. "Ethan, are you waiting because you are uncertain, or because you know something the rest of us do not?" I smiled into the fading sunlight. "Neither," I answered. "I am waiting because every contract they sign ties another knot in the same rope." He looked toward the entrance road, then back at me, still confused. I understood why. Most people think patience means doing nothing. Real patience means allowing the truth enough time to reveal itself completely. The following Monday, county maintenance crews installed directional signs along the state highway pointing drivers toward Cedar Ridge Estates. Those signs directed traffic onto the very pavement crossing my land. The development celebrated the milestone with balloons, food trucks, and a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Linda Harper stood beneath the stone monument thanking investors, local business leaders, and new homeowners for believing in the community's vision. Cameras flashed while applause echoed across the fields my grandfather once used for grazing cattle. I remained several hundred yards away, leaning against my fence with the evening breeze carrying distant laughter across the pasture. Nobody noticed me. Nobody needed to. Every speech, every photograph, every recorded promise made that celebration more valuable than anything I could have accomplished by interrupting it. They believed they were celebrating success. I quietly watched them transform temporary mistakes into permanent records that no one would ever be able to erase. By the beginning of the 3rd week, Cedar Ridge Estates had settled into a comfortable routine that made everything appear completely ordinary. School buses stopped near the entrance every morning. Delivery vans rolled through the stone gateway with packages stacked to the roof. Landscapers trimmed shrubs along the median, while sprinklers clicked steadily across fresh green grass. The place looked established, as though it had always been there. That illusion was exactly what made it so dangerous for the people creating it. Permanent appearances often encourage permanent decisions. I spent my mornings repairing fences, checking water tanks, and walking sections of the ranch that my grandfather once inspected on horseback. Every so often I stopped near the southern boundary and watched another parade of vehicles travel across the pavement that legally remained part of my property. Nobody questioned it anymore. The entrance road had become accepted simply because people used it every day. That is how assumptions replace facts. One afternoon, I received an invitation in the mail addressed to nearby landowners. The Homeowners Association was hosting a community appreciation gathering at the entrance plaza to celebrate reaching its first 100 home sales. The invitation featured the same aerial photograph I had already collected, complete with the landscaped boulevard stretching confidently across my ranch. I placed the invitation beside the brochures, newspaper articles, and advertisements already filling the binder. Every page told the same story from a different angle. Every page confirmed that the association was publicly claiming something it never legally possessed. A few days later, I attended the gathering without announcing who I was. People assumed I was simply another local resident curious about the new development. Linda Harper stood beneath a white canopy greeting visitors with effortless confidence. Behind her hung a large display board showing future expansion plans. The map included additional neighborhoods that would all rely on the same entrance road. Investors nodded with approval while builders discussed construction schedules stretching years into the future. One representative proudly explained that the entrance corridor was the foundation supporting the entire master plan. I listened quietly, accepted a brochure, thanked him for the information, and walked away before anyone recognized my name. As I reached my truck, I noticed a survey company vehicle parked near the sales office. The crew was not measuring property lines. They were documenting completed improvements for financing and insurance purposes. Cameras clicked while drones lifted into the bright afternoon sky. Those reports would eventually certify the value of infrastructure built on land that still belonged to my family. That evening, I called an old colleague named Robert Ellis, a licensed land surveyor I had trusted for years while managing highway projects. I did not ask him to challenge anyone or contact the county. I simply asked whether he could verify every original monument along my southern boundary without disturbing a single stone or fence post. He agreed immediately. 2 mornings later, we walked the property together before sunrise, carrying survey equipment through dew-covered grass. One by one, we uncovered the original iron markers my grandfather had described decades earlier. They had never moved. They had merely been hidden beneath fresh grading and decorative landscaping. Robert looked up from his instruments, glanced toward the elegant entrance boulevard, and slowly smiled. "Ethan," he said quietly, "they built exactly where these records say they should not have." I looked across the smooth pavement as commuters disappeared into the subdivision, completely unaware that beneath their tires lay a line that had never changed, no matter how many signs, speeches, celebrations, or sales contracts tried to convince the world otherwise. Robert returned 3 days later carrying a weathered aluminum survey case that looked older than some of the houses inside Cedar Ridge Estates. The morning air was cool enough for a light jacket, and a layer of fog drifted across the lower pasture before the rising sun slowly burned it away. We walked the southern boundary one marker at a time, stopping only when his equipment confirmed what both of us already suspected. Every original monument matched the legal descriptions recorded decades earlier. Nothing had shifted. Nothing had disappeared. The land had remained exactly where it had always been. The only thing that had changed was what people believed about it. Back at the ranch house, Robert spread several large survey maps across my dining room table. Beside them, I placed the brochures, newspaper articles, promotional postcards, photographs, and invitations I had quietly collected over the previous weeks. The table looked less like a family dining room and more like an evidence archive. Robert traced the boundary with his finger before looking directly at me. "The pavement crosses your property for nearly 800 feet, he said. "The monument sign is on your land. Part of the landscape median is on your land. Even those decorative lights are inside your boundary. I nodded without saying much. The facts spoke louder than either of us needed to. That afternoon, I drove to the county records office, not to file a complaint, but to request copies of every publicly available document connected to the subdivision's approval process. The clerk recognized my name and disappeared into the records room before returning with a stack of permits, engineering drawings, and planning documents. I thanked her, carried everything back to my truck, and spent the next several hours reading each page carefully. One sentence immediately caught my attention. The county had approved construction standards for the roadway itself, but nowhere did the documents grant ownership, transfer title, or establish a permanent easement across my ranch. The approval allowed a road to be built if the developer possessed the necessary property rights. It did not create those rights. That distinction was small enough for most people to overlook, but in land law it changes everything. By early evening, I had highlighted the relevant sections and placed copies inside the growing binder. Later that week, I noticed another wave of activity inside the subdivision. More moving trucks arrived. Additional homes closed. New families unpacked patio furniture while children rode bicycles along sidewalks leading toward the entrance road. Contractors installed another neighborhood directory beside the monument sign, listing future phases that had not even broken ground yet. Every improvement represented another financial commitment built around a single assumption that had never been legally verified. Linda continued speaking with complete confidence. During community meetings, proudly explaining expansion plans and welcoming residents to what she called their permanent front entrance. She sounded relaxed because no one had questioned her version of events. Confidence often grows strongest when it has never been tested. As the sun set that evening, I stood beside the original iron survey marker hidden beneath a patch of tall prairie grass. I brushed away the dirt until the weathered metal became visible again. My grandfather had once told me that boundaries do not move simply because people stop looking at them. Standing there with decades of records, fresh survey data, official permits, and months of public claims now pointing toward the same unavoidable truth, I finally realized the waiting was almost over. They had spent weeks strengthening their position in public while quietly weakening it in law, and they still had no idea the difference between the two. The next Monday began with a sky so clear it almost looked painted. A cool breeze carried the scent of freshly cut hay across the northern pasture, while the first rays of sunlight reflected off the stone entrance hundreds of yards away. From my porch, I watched commuters leave Cedar Ridge Estates one after another, each vehicle rolling across the same stretch of pavement that everyone now accepted as permanent. Habit has a strange way of disguising uncertainty. The longer people repeat something, the less likely they are to question whether it was ever correct in the first place. Inside my study, the leather binder had grown thick enough that it barely closed. Survey maps rested beside engineering permits. Newspaper articles sat next to promotional postcards. Photographs of the monument sign were organized by date, showing each new improvement added week after week. Every document told the same story from a different perspective, and together they formed a timeline no attorney could easily dismiss. I called Robert and asked him to prepare a certified survey package with every boundary monument, measurement, and supporting exhibit clearly documented. I also contacted a property attorney named Daniel Brooks, someone I had worked with years earlier on public infrastructure projects. Instead of asking whether I had a case, he spent nearly an hour reviewing the records before quietly setting the binder on his desk. Then he smiled. "Ethan," he said, "I have seen boundary disputes before. I have seen easement disputes. I have never seen someone hand me this much organized evidence before filing the first motion." That was exactly the point. I had never wanted an argument. I wanted certainty. Over the following days, Daniel requested certified copies of every recorded deed, every subdivision filing, and every planning document connected to Cedar Ridge Estates. Nothing contradicted the original property line. Nothing created a legal right for the association to occupy my land. Meanwhile, life inside the subdivision continued exactly as before. More homes closed. More moving trucks arrived. The association announced plans for a seasonal neighborhood festival beside the landscaped entrance. Social media pages proudly displayed photographs of families gathering beneath the monument sign, calling it the heart of the community. Linda appeared in nearly every picture, smiling with complete confidence as if the future had already been guaranteed. She still had no reason to suspect that every public celebration was quietly strengthening the record we were preparing. One afternoon, Daniel called with the final piece we needed. His title review confirmed that no recorded easement had ever been granted by my family, by any previous owner, or by any court. There was no missing document waiting to surprise us. There was no forgotten agreement buried inside an old filing cabinet. The assumption supporting the entire entrance road simply did not exist. I drove to the southern boundary just before sunset and stood beside the weathered iron survey marker hidden beneath the prairie grass. Beyond it, the landscaped boulevard glowed beneath elegant streetlights while residents returned home from work, completely unaware of the invisible line beneath their tires. I felt no anger as I watched them pass. Most of them had purchased their homes in good faith, trusting the promises made to them. The responsibility rested elsewhere. Weeks earlier, Linda had mistaken my silence for surrender. In reality, silence had given her all the time she needed to finish building a story that could no longer be rewritten, and by the time the final documents were placed inside that worn leather binder, every promise she had proudly repeated had become part of the same unavoidable truth. The call from Daniel came just after sunrise. His voice was calm, almost routine, but I recognized the quiet confidence behind every word. The court had signed the temporary injunction. The certified survey, the recorded deeds, the engineering permits, the title review, the advertisements, the newspaper articles, and the promotional materials all pointed to the same conclusion. The association had built and operated its primary entrance across private property without a recorded legal right to do so. Weeks of careful preparation had become a single stack of documents carrying the weight of decades of ownership. By mid-morning, several county officials arrived at the southern boundary accompanied by Daniel, Robert, and a deputy from the sheriff's office whose role was simply to keep the process orderly. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The only sounds were the steady breeze moving through the oak trees and the occasional car slowing as drivers realized something unusual was happening near the entrance. Linda's white sport utility vehicle appeared only minutes later. She stepped out with the same confidence I had seen during every ribbon cutting, every sales event, and every neighborhood celebration. She walked toward Daniel carrying a folder thick with community paperwork. From where I stood, I could not hear every sentence, but I watched her expression slowly change as each certified document was placed in front of her. First came the original deed, then the historical surveys, then Robert's certified boundary report. Finally, the title opinion confirming there had never been a recorded easement granting access across my ranch. For the first time since this began, Linda stopped speaking. Around us, residents gathered quietly along the sidewalks, trying to understand why county officials were examining survey markers hidden beneath decorative landscaping. Several homeowners looked back and forth between the stone monument and the documents resting on the hood of Daniel's truck. They had purchased homes believing every representation made during the sales process was accurate. None of them had any reason to suspect otherwise. Daniel remained respectful throughout the entire conversation. He explained that the court's order did not accuse the homeowners of wrongdoing. It simply recognized an ownership issue that required immediate protection until the legal process reached its conclusion. The deputy confirmed the order, and county officials documented every affected improvement with photographs and measurements. By early afternoon, temporary barriers were placed across the section of roadway crossing my property exactly where the certified survey indicated my southern boundary began. Traffic was safely redirected through an emergency construction access road that developers had originally used months earlier. It was less convenient, but it allowed residents to continue entering and leaving the neighborhood while legal questions were addressed. The elegant stone monument that had welcomed hundreds of visitors suddenly stood behind temporary fencing, no longer representing certainty but unanswered decisions. Reporters from the local newspaper arrived before sunset after hearing about the court order. They photographed the survey markers, the certified maps, and the entrance everyone had assumed belonged to the association. Linda declined to answer questions and quietly left with several board members. As the evening light settled across the valley, I stood beside the same weathered iron marker my grandfather had trusted decades earlier. Nothing about the land had changed. The grass still moved with the wind. The creek still followed the same gentle curve. The property line remained exactly where it had always been. The only thing that changed that day was that everyone else could finally see it too. The weeks that followed moved far more quietly than everything that came before them, yet they carried the greatest weight. Once the court records became public, the story spread across the county faster than any advertisement Cedar Ridge Estates had ever printed. Residents who had trusted every presentation during the buying process began asking careful questions instead of accepting confident answers. Developers reviewed contracts. Lenders requested updated reports. Engineers revisited site plans. None of those conversations happened because someone shouted the loudest. They happened because the facts finally stood where everyone could see them. Daniel kept me informed as the legal process continued. Negotiations replaced arguments almost immediately. The association understood that the certified surveys, historical deeds, title records, and their own promotional materials all pointed in the same direction. Every brochure claiming ownership, every interview describing the entrance as community property, every photograph celebrating the stone monument had become part of a record they could not explain away. Eventually, an agreement was reached. The association accepted responsibility for the unauthorized improvements and agreed to compensate my family for the use of the property while funding a redesigned entrance located entirely within land they legally controlled. Construction crews returned a few months later, but this time the atmosphere felt completely different. There were no grand speeches, no oversized banners, and no ribbon-cutting ceremony. The decorative monument that once stood on my ranch was carefully removed, the landscaping restored, and the pavement crossing my property was taken out section by section. Native grass was replanted where traffic had once flowed every morning. After the first spring rain, the land began to look the way it always had, as if it had simply been waiting for the chance to breathe again. I watched from the same porch where I had spent so many quiet mornings drinking coffee while everyone believed I had already been defeated. Bill stopped by one evening, carrying 2 bottles of root beer, just like he had weeks earlier. We sat together watching the sunset stretch across the pastures. He smiled and shook his head before saying, "I finally understand why you never rushed." I looked toward the southern boundary where the old iron survey marker still rested beneath the prairie grass. It had survived droughts, storms, changing generations, and one very expensive mistake. The land never needed me to win an argument, I told him. It only needed the truth to catch up. Linda Harper eventually stepped away from her position with the association. I never celebrated that decision because it was never about defeating a person. It was about protecting something that had been entrusted to my family long before I was born. Most of the homeowners continued building their lives, now entering through a properly approved roadway that belonged exactly where it should have been from the beginning. In time, the headlines disappeared, the reporters moved on, and another season settled over the ranch. The cedar trees still filled the air with their familiar scent after every rain. The creek still traced the same gentle path across the property. The old leather binder returned to its place inside my father's filing cabinet, its pages no longer waiting for the right moment. Sometimes people think justice arrives with dramatic speeches or unforgettable confrontations. My experience taught me something much simpler. Justice is often quiet. It waits patiently while assumptions grow into evidence, while confidence turns into accountability, and while the truth remains exactly where it has always been. My grandfather was right all those years ago. Boundaries do not move simply because people stop looking at them, and in the end, neither does the truth.